like, and subscribe.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Rasilius, you talked about the strength of Canada's contribution, and you sort of praised the effort to date and characterized it as applying the maximum capability that's possible. But the recent American leaks had indicated that our allies, including the United States, are skeptical or concerned about Canada's ability to maintain NATO battle groups while aiding Ukraine. So how sustainable is the present deployment? How have failures to increase personnel numbers jeopardized our ability to maintain even the current commitments that we have made, or to enable Canada to up our contribution to ensuring that Ukraine ultimately prevails?
My understanding of the leaks that you refer to is that what they're saying is that Canada, what the concern of some allies is that we cannot maintain or take on another operational assignment other than what we've got now. That's the issue. So yes, we can't. That's why we didn't go to Haiti, I assume. You know? Now the question then becomes: it's really the brigade or the battalion going to brigade level group in Latvia. That is the real question. And we have not yet seen the Canadian government come forth with its plans. I understand that there is planning underway for that, discussions underway for that, but that's the litmus test to come. And I suspect that at Vilnius, I'm guessing, that maybe the Canadian government will announce it there.
Okay, so you think there is capacity there? It's not.
My understanding is that we, the Canadian armed military, are going to work toward establishing, as lead nation, a brigade group. But again, we are not the sole providers of forces for that brigade group. So I'm sure that we are going around the NATO circles, and there's another group of countries that are with us in Latvia, and they are plussing up as well. And so we're negotiating how do we all together get to the brigade.
Okay. I'm going to go back to something you said about China and the apparent, or you said that you thought China's goal was to ensure that Russia doesn't lose so much as that. But what does Russia not losing even look like? The minimalist positions of both sides don't leave room for a compromise solution. At least I don't see one. Could you? I mean. Well, go ahead. I'll let you.
So not losing, because losing is going back to the 1991 borders of Ukraine, including the Russians losing Crimea and losing the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. That's something that they've always had. Even in 1991, when Ukraine became independent, the Russians had a lease arrangement with Ukraine to keep the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. So that, from the Russian point of view, would be an existential defeat. So the Chinese, I believe, do not want that to happen. So it would be something short of that. And so then you have scenarios. There is a return to the February 24, 2022 line, for example, the Minsk II lines and so on. Those are options that are being discussed. But
those would be Ukraine losing to the Ukrainian side.
Everyone loses. Like no winners, no losers, you can say.
Okay. Then I'll maybe go to. So I've got about a minute left. I'll maybe go to Mr. Jenkins about productivity capability. The expenditure of basic artillery shells and ammunition. I'm not talking about smart or sophisticated guided ordnance, but just plain artillery shells. How can Western countries, in particular Canada, if you can comment on Canada's productive capability, what needs to be done to ensure that Ukraine just flat out doesn't run out of shells?
If we're talking about artillery shells, and we're not talking about smart weapons are more complicated because the pieces to them involve more than a single country. Manufacturing is very, very complicated. If we're talking about old-fashioned artillery shells, then this is a matter of manufacturing capability. We years ago, decades ago, we had this capacity. It has understandably atrophied over the years without a Cold War push behind it. I think the military services have been understandably, I don't want to say mesmerized, but certainly attracted to the more high-tech weapons. And the idea of artillery tubes and old-fashioned 155 shells was not the most exciting thing. As it turns out, they in this particular type of war have proved to be critical. I don't think it's a matter of any country's individual capacity. I think that is a matter of NATO planning and, in a sense, parsing out who can do what to bring up the overall level of production. Defense budgets on the production of weapons tend to be geared a great deal toward the national industry.
And we're unfortunately going to have to leave Mr.
Right.
Kelly's inquiries there. He's very cleverly turned 5 minutes into 6.5.
Happened.
Yes, yes.
I want to thank both our witnesses for being here. We're having this conversation about, that all wars end at the negotiating table. And I know my conversations with Ukrainian officials, they fully appreciate that fact. But as Mr. Jenkins just said, the will to fight and the valor and the dogged determination of the people of Ukraine has to be brought into the equation here, and their right to self-determination. And essentially, President Zelensky has turned into a modern day Winston Churchill in how he's conducted himself and how he's inspired not just Ukrainians but the free world. Ukrainians, rightfully so, are mistrusting of the peace process. Minsk I, Minsk II were disasters and ultimately ended up in the war that we have today. So there's no trust. And so maybe we're still not at the place of the negotiation tables of trying to find a peaceful resolution. So the question becomes, we know the Ukrainians are going to keep on fighting. We know that the weapon systems they have are surprisingly matching what Russia's brought to bear. And maybe it's more surprising of what Russia hasn't been able to accomplish with what's supposed to be one of the greatest militaries in the world. So my question is about resiliency of the alliance and the support of our citizens, as was alluded to earlier. We are seeing an erosion of that willingness from Canadians, from Americans, from some of our European allies, and to continue to stand with Ukraine. And a lot of that has to do with the success of the Russian information operations and their dissemination of disinformation, misinformation, and outright lies. So my question is, how do we counter that to ensure that Canadians, taxpayers, our military, as well as our allies like the United States, aren't being distracted by fake news?
So the challenge, if I'll go first then, the challenge is in a war of, essentially it's a war of attrition, but there are various dynamics, and we have to see where the Ukrainian offensive will now go. How dynamic will it be? And that dynamism will, in fact, affect public opinion in and of itself. Political leaderships in the West are fully on board with Ukraine. The issue, as you correctly point out, is the populations. And there are various pollings in various countries that suggest that it's not a uniform thing. That certainly the political leadership's uniform, but the people are not necessarily so. And and I don't want to make specific points to countries, but generally as you move further west, away from the Russian borders and Ukraine's borders, support amongst the populations tend to soften a bit in certain areas. But I think since the United States, and I put the finger on Mr. Jenkins on this one, he can pick it up. The United States is the biggest backer for Ukraine. And the American willingness politically of the people and the Congress to support the president, whether it's this president or the next president, to sustain this effort in what will still be some kind of an attritional warfare is right now uncertain. And I think we're into a very interesting situation. The support is there now, but we know that there are elements of the Republican Party that are not supportive. And we can leave it at that for now. I don't know where it's going to go.
A little more than a minute.
Okay, so just I want to ask the question about, especially with Mr. Razoulis's, experience dealing with arms control and nuclear weapons. Russia moving warheads now into Belarus. How do you see that playing out, especially with Putin continually rattling that nuclear saber as a deterrence measure?
Sure. I'll be very quick. This is a key component. I mean, Mr. Jenkins has mentioned that. That is part of Russia's other side. There's the conventional war going on, but there is the nuclear deterrent aspect and the nuclear threat aspect. Putting nuclear forces in Belarus is very consistent with an escalatory rhetoric now that Russia's doing, and they're actually putting forces into Belarus to back up the rhetoric. The key thing then, so there's tactical and then there's strategic nuclear, the thermonuclear stuff. And there I'll just leave my comments with you with Medvedev, the Russian chief of their National Security Council, has stated very clearly in the last month, and he said, Crimea is existential. And Russia will use, and he uses the word, all weapons. That's not just the tactical stuff. That means thermonuclear, to defend Russia. Now, what he's saying is not, he doesn't want to use the stuff, but he wants to threaten, to dissuade, deter Ukrainians with the American pressure on the Ukrainians not to attack Crimea.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when we look at, we talked about the comments made by the Chinese ambassador to France. We had recent comments made by the South African ambassador to Canada that criticized us for not being the soft power that he envisions us to be and being too closely aligned with Ukraine. And I'm just wondering, are those appropriate comments to be made by so-called diplomats, to be engaged more in bilateral relationships with the countries that they're stationed in, or is this part of a greater strategy to undermine Western support, to question the resiliency of the alliance, particularly here in Canada? And essentially, it's I think some people have described it as wolf diplomacy.
So on the Chinese factor, I think we've spoken about that, and we know that that's not the Chinese position. But South Africa is an interesting one, and Mr. Jenkins has alluded to colonial histories and so on. And the government of South Africa, and we just spoke about apartheid, the Soviet Union in the Cold War was very much supportive of the anti-apartheid movement, and they are the ruling party. So they remember that. And so what we get from South Africa, we've had this for months now. They've been exercises that have the Chinese Navy, the Russian Navy, and the South African Navy have been exercising. In fact, they were doing it around the anniversary of the war in February.
Right now.
And they're still doing it right now. So the point is that the South Africans have a historical legacy, and they're speaking to that. And that's where they're coming from.
So the Chinese ambassador made the comment that the former Soviet states don't have any way to be recognized internationally. Can the same argument then be made about Russia, and especially them never accepting the UN Charter, never passing a single resolution in the Duma to recognize the UN Charter or provide them the ascension to the UN Security Council? It perturbed me greatly to watch just the last couple of days ago see Sergei Lavrov chair the UN Security Council meeting.
Well, I mean, the point is that international states become legitimate when they have international recognition. And that's really not even 100% based on the United Nations. When the Soviet Union came apart, it was individual countries, like Canada was one of the first that recognized a number of the countries, the Baltics, Ukraine, and so on. It's the actual states' recognition. It's the United Nations is an umbrella organization, but it is not a world government. And it's the actions of individual states that count. And so individual states have recognized certain countries, and that's what counts.
Mr. Jenkins, you recently wrote that the longer the war drags on, the more risk Putin might be willing to take. So the question I have for you is, when we talk about resiliency among Canada, U.S., and our citizens, how much longer are the people of Russia prepared to sacrifice their young men and women in this war?
Again, I would love to be able to answer that. We have no way of providing an answer to that. I certainly agree with my partner here that we have no evidence of a significantly strong anti-Putin movement in Russia.
Mr. Jenkins, we did see a lot of Russian men flee the country to escape conscription. So, and is that starting to play out amongst the populace? Is that they just do not want to be sending their sons and daughters, their husbands and wives to the front?
No, I think that was significant, and in fact, given that those are individuals that are probably the best educated, well trained, and therefore most likely to find employment in other countries, that represented a significant loss. At the same time, it probably reduced some of the internal pressure or sources of internal pressure on Russia. A lot of the recruits for the Russian forces are coming from the distant provinces, different towns. They're not sending the sons of the elite middle classes in St. Petersburg and Moscow into this war yet. That would change things possibly. One aside I want to make here very, very quickly. We're talking about human resources and trained human resources. Finding a way to usefully employ and exploit that exodus from Russia is something we should be paying very, very close attention to. These are people that have made personal decisions to avoid the draft. They have pulled up the roots and left the country. That is a potential resource. I'm not talking about giving them rifles and sending them into the front in Ukraine. But that is a significant resource that could be useful to the West.
You, Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Bazan, final 5 minutes, Ms. O'Connell.